Angie had recently moved to her own apartment by herself after she had an argument with her mother and moved out. But at around 9:15 p.m. on June 12th, Angie went back to her mother's house to make amends. The two talked, and Angie told her mother about how excited she was to start this new life, that she would be living on her own, but also how stressful it was that she had to be independent and all grown up. About an hour later, Angie left her mom's house and joined a group of friends known as the River Rats to a nearby outdoor spot. Chris Tapp was a young man who was also part of this River Rats group. He saw Angie at this hangout, but they didn't really talk much. Instead, Chris was trying to talk to another young woman who he was flirting with and trying to bring back to his apartment. Eventually, Chris and this other woman did leave together. They went back to Chris's apartment, and they ended up hooking up that night. Angie stayed and hung out with her friends for a little bit longer, but she too eventually left and just went back to her apartment. Directly across the street from Angie's house lived a man by the name of Brian Dips. On that night, Brian had been going out drinking. He actually came home around 11:30 p.m. that night, but then he decided to leave again and continue partying. He then came home around 3 a.m. and later stated that he was so drunk that he couldn't remember where he went, who he was with, or what he did during that time. By the early morning on June 13th the next day, Angie was supposed to be getting ready for work. She had a shift at Beauty for All Seasons, which was a makeup store in town where she answered calls and processed orders for the company. Her shift started at 7 a.m., but Angie never showed up. A few hours later, her coworkers tried calling her, but she didn't answer. This was unusual for Angie, so her coworkers got into their car and drove to her house to check in on her. When they got to Angie's apartment, the front door was closed but unlocked, so they made their way inside and looked around. When they made their way to Angie's bedroom, they saw her body on the floor. Around 11:15 that morning, Detective Jeff Pratt got the call that there had been a suspicious death. That same morning, Chris's life was moving in a completely different direction. Chris and the woman he brought home the night before had slept in. Chris's girlfriend, who was coming over that day, walked in on them and caught them in bed together. Everyone started to argue, and eventually Chris's girlfriend and the woman that he had brought home the night before left Chris's apartment. Across the street from Angie's apartment, Brian woke up extremely hungover to the sounds and lights of police cars across the street at Angie's apartment. When Detective Pratt arrived at the apartment, he saw no clear signs of forced entry, but there were signs of a struggle. This is Unreasonable Doubts, a true crime series that analyzes wrongful convictions. To see more wrongful conviction content, please like and subscribe. The crime scene was violent. Furniture had been knocked over, dishes were broken, and Angie had cuts on her hands as if she had been defending herself. Angie had been stabbed to death, and based on her body position and lack of clothing, Detective Pratt determined that she had also been sexually assaulted. Evidence from the crime scene was collected, including semen from Angie's body and hairs left in Angie's hand. Based on the DNA testing available at the time, those samples were determined to come from the same man, but forensics couldn't determine who from. Police could only determine whose DNA the evidence belonged to by collecting DNA from men in the area and then analyzing whether or not it matched to the DNA at the crime scene. However, police didn't know who to look for, who Angie was with that night, or who to test. So for months, the case went unsolved. Police were stuck in a tough position because they had DNA evidence and even tested it, but couldn't find a match no matter how much they searched. Then, in January 1997, so 6 months after the murder, police finally found a lead. A man named Benjamin Hobbs had been arrested in Nevada a few months prior for sexually assaulting a woman at knife point. Benjamin was originally from Idaho Falls and was part of the River Rats group, but had since moved to Ely, Nevada. Because this case was so similar to Angie's, Idaho police flew to Nevada to interview Benjamin, hoping he would confess to Angie's murder. However, instead of confessing, Benjamin told police that they should talk to his friend, who was also part of the River Rats group, who probably knows something about the case. That friend was Chris Tapp, the same man who saw Angie the night before she was murdered, who had gone home with a young woman, hooked up, and was caught by his girlfriend the next day. Chris Tapp was born and raised in Idaho Falls, Idaho. He played sports growing up and later attended Skyline High School. At 19 years old, he was part of this group called the River Rats, but mainly this was just a group of friends who hung around the Snake River trails of Idaho Falls. Angie Dodge was an 18-year-old woman who lived around the neighborhood and also was part of this River Rats group. Angie and Chris weren't strangers, but they also didn't know each other too well either. When police returned from interviewing Ben in Nevada, they turned their attention to Chris.
I mean, I'm going to be straight up and truthful with you. If I did anything know about this, I would say, but I do not know. That's all that's true.
Chris initially denied all involvement in Angie's murder, but by the end of his second interrogation, police were trying to get Chris to explain Benjamin's involvement. Benjamin had become the focus of the investigation, and Chris was useful because he knew him. So investigators gave Chris a lie detector test. They pressed him about Benjamin and warned him that if he was hiding anything, that he could be charged with conspiracy and face the same punishment as the person who committed the murder themselves.
Right now, Chris, you can be charged with conspiracy, which means basically Idaho law states that if you're convicted of conspiracy, you take the same punishment and the same fall as if you actually did commit the crime itself.
This was the first major pressure point that investigators put on Chris. Chris was being told that silence, confusion, or even a wrong answer could make him legally responsible for the murder. But Chris was never in Angie's apartment, so he couldn't give police a true story. And when he denied knowing anything, police increased the pressure.
I want you to seriously think what I told you in the car, okay? That little bit extra you got, we're going to be able to take Ben and we're going to drop kick him through the goalposts of life.
Eventually, Chris gave police a version where Ben was involved in Angie's murder, but the DNA from Angie's apartment didn't match Ben's. So Chris started introducing a third person, a man by the name of Jeremy Sargis. Jeremy was another young man from Chris and Benjamin's social circle, the River Rats, and he became important only after the DNA created a problem in their theory.
It was Ben Hobbs, Jeremy Sargis, and yourself at Angie Dodge's apartment when she was killed. Not died, when she was killed.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Do you remember?
I'm speculating that Jerry was there, Chris. So I'm gonna go yes on that.
Now, Chris described a version where Benjamin and Jeremy sexually assaulted Angie, while Chris helped by holding her down. But by Chris's seventh interrogation, the story again started to fall apart.
Chris, you told us Jeremy Sargis was there. You not only told us that he was there, but he took an active part in it. Now we're finding out that Sargis probably wasn't there and that you were screwing with us.
But why would I pass the lie detector test then, Jerry?
You didn't. You have not passed the lie detector test.
I passed the last one?
No, you did not pass the last one. So when Chris Tapp tells us things, we think, great, cool, that sounds pretty good. I think he may be telling us the truth this time. We go check it out, and it's bogus.
The DNA didn't match Jeremy either, and Jeremy's alibi checked out after police interviewed him. Instead of treating all of this like a warning sign that Chris's confession might be unreliable, investigators treated it as proof that Chris was lying about the extent of his involvement. By the eighth and final interrogation, Chris's story changed to only Ben first sexually assaulting Angie and then forcing Chris to stab her to death. At the trial, the prosecution didn't have any physical evidence to place Chris at the crime scene, but now they had Chris's confession that he murdered her. On May 28, 1998, a jury found Chris guilty of first-degree murder, sexual assault, and the use of a deadly weapon. He was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years in prison. Ben was never charged with any crime related to Angie's death. For the next 2 decades, Chris kept challenging the case. He filed multiple appeals, including a request to throw out his admission, a petition for post-conviction release, that he had diminished capacity during the interrogation, a call to test the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene, failure of the prosecution to disclose exculpatory evidence, and that his confession was contaminated. But even after all that fighting, the court kept coming back to the same conclusion. Chris made a confession, and that was good enough to ignore any other evidence. However, during this time, back in 2007, the Idaho Innocence Project began reviewing Chris's case. The Innocence Project is an organization that takes on cases of potentially wrongfully convicted individuals, often retesting DNA evidence to secure a person's exoneration. The organization studied Chris's interrogation tapes and focused on the unmatched DNA collected from Angie's apartment. This sparked even Angie's family to start questioning Chris's confession and whether or not it was true. In 2014, this finally led investigators to try a different kind of DNA search. Instead of searching for an exact match to an unknown male profile, they searched for a family connection. They used a public genealogy database. That's what is now known today as Ancestry.com. They focused on the Y chromosome, which follows the male line, which produced a partial match to a man named Michael Usry Sr. Michael Sr. shared 34 of the 35 markers with this unknown DNA profile from Angie's apartment. This didn't mean that Michael Sr. was the killer, just that the murderer might be in Michael's family line. Investigators began working on the family tree and eventually focused on Michael's son, Michael Jr. But when they interrogated and tested Michael Jr.'s DNA, it didn't match either. This case raised serious privacy concerns about DNA profiling and how Ancestry may be providing data without users' consent. But after the DNA investigation, Chris's case was reviewed in more depth, and in 2017, after spending 20 years in prison, the court dismissed the sexual assault and weapon convictions. His sentence was reduced to time served, and Chris walked out of prison at 40 years old. But the murder conviction still remained, and Chris and the Innocence Project weren't done fighting for his full exoneration. They fought for 2 more years, and in 2019, the unknown DNA profile led investigators to another man that had been sitting near the case since the beginning. Brian Dripps, the man that lived across the street. After further interrogation, Brian Dripps finally confessed to raping and killing Angie. Most importantly, Brian admitted that he acted alone. At this point, Chris is already out of prison, but the system hasn't admitted that he was innocent. But now that Brian had admitted to killing Angie, Chris's murder conviction was finally vacated by a judge on July 17, 2019. For the first time since 1997, Chris was officially innocent. In February 2021, Brian Dripps pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and sexual assault and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He was 55 years old. After his exoneration, Chris tried to rebuild what was left of his life and would later sue the city of Idaho Falls. In June 2022, a settlement was reached for $11.7 million. However, only a year later, Chris would die after an altercation in a Las Vegas hotel room. Daniel Rodimer, a retired professional wrestler, former football player, and former political candidate, who was in the room with Chris at the time of his death, was later arrested and charged with Chris's murder. Daniel has pleaded not guilty, and his trial is scheduled for June 2026. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more, please consider subscribing.